Record. I hope that my audio is okay. I was having some garbled issues with it, so forgive me if I sound funny. You probably couldn't tell because I'll be garbled, that I'm apologizing. But welcome back to our third and final session of Second Steps in Beekeeping. We're real lucky this evening to have Dr. Garrett Slater speaking to us on Varroa mites and diseases and some other projects that he's got going on. He is our extension specialist with the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service apiculture program. So he's the head honcho of the apiculture group and has a lot of cool research projects and educational outreach programs and other things going on related to honeybees. And so y'all are going to definitely learn a lot from him. Thank you, Garrett, for speaking with us tonight. And I think that I set you up as a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen and everything.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I know more and more people are logging on, but we're recording. And so if they're coming on late, they can certainly catch the beginning of it later on.
Awesome. Do you want to jump right into it?
If you're ready for it, yeah,
Okay.
I'm ready.
Awesome. Awesome. Sounds good. Well, yeah. First off, yeah, welcome to your second year of beekeeping. One thing I always tell people is the first year is always the easiest, and then after that it gets harder and harder. So, hopefully, you guys had a first good year, and hopefully we can prepare you for the year coming on. So, like Molly mentioned, I'm the statewide honeybee specialist, so I provide support for beekeepers across the entire state. And one thing I do is I work with Molly and our other specialists to develop programs to support beekeepers across the state. Now, one thing I'm really passionate about is diseases and hive inspections. So, these are things that you may run into, these are things you may not run into, but the one thing that you should know is, what does a healthy colony look like? And in a situation where you see something that you may not think is, kosher or the colony may not look healthy, what should you do in that situation? So today I'll talk about kind of colony inspections, Varroa diseases, and kind of all things that go into why your bees die. Before I do want to talk about the Texas Master Beekeeper program. I know Molly may have spoken about it, maybe not, but this is a program that's run by Texas A&M Extension, and it's sort of a multi-tier program. So it's for beekeepers that are new to beekeeping. It's also for beekeepers that have, years and even decades of experience. And so I do encourage you guys all to join the Texas Master Beekeeping program. Um, just a little bit about it. There's four different levels as part of the program. We have our apprentice level, advanced level, master, and master craftsman level. The apprentice level is really designed for new beekeepers or people that are interested in getting into bees. And so, for everybody that's signed up for this webinar series for this program, the apprentice level is a very, very good first start. And we have a 10-week course as part of the apprentice level. It starts in February. It's every week for 3 hours. So it's about 30 hours of programming. But we do cover a lot of information because there is a lot about keeping bees and keeping bees alive. So you can either attend those live sessions or watch recordings afterwards. And then hopefully you decide to progress to the program where you get to the advanced master, master craftsman level, where there's some public service hours involved with it, plus more hands-on education. So, when Molly approached me about talking about diseases and viral mites and other things that you could be dealing with going into your second year of beekeeping, I always like to take a step back and talk about colony losses. So, some of you have probably, and most of you have probably had bees for your first year. And so you may have not experienced colony losses, or maybe you have been. But this is kind of all to say that beekeepers across the country lose bees every single year. Even the most experienced beekeepers lose bees every single year. And so this is all to say that you may lose bees, going into the winter, you may lose bees next year, but don't get discouraged because this is something that we all deal with. And, us as an extension agency, our role is to really support you in any way possible. So this kind of shows you the colony losses over the past, I guess about 14 years or so. So really, ever since 2005, beekeepers lose somewhere between 40 to 50% of their colonies. And this past year, which I don't have this updated here, but beekeepers in Texas lost about 50 to 62% of their colonies. So it's really high. And the major reason for that is, the varroa mites, diseases, and other things, which I'll talk about later on. So, it's really important to really understand why your bees died so you can prevent those losses in the future. So I guess some people will be jumping on, but I'm kind of curious if you guys have lost colonies already, or maybe have a reason for why your bees died. I don't know if I can see the chat here, maybe not. So, so when we think about colony losses, right? So maybe you guys have lost bees already, or maybe you guys will lose bees into the winter. One thing I like to just, kind of take a step back and talk about the reasons why bees die. So there's really the five P's for colony losses. We have parasites, pathogens, pesticides, poor nutrition, and poor queens. So the number one is parasites, and currently the only parasite we have in the United States is the Varroa mite. Um, if you've never seen a Varroa mite, just know that they're in there, and you should be monitoring for your Varroa mites, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. But if the Varroa mites get too high in your colonies have a really high chance of crashing and dying at the end of the season. And this is why the second year is really important because, it takes a couple years for the levels in your colonies to grow to a level that causes these massive colony losses. And so you may not treat at all this year, you may not monitor at all this year, but if you don't do that going into next year, then that's when you start seeing all your bees die. That includes like a financial investment in replacing those bees. And so just know that going into your second year of beekeeping, Varroa is going to be becoming a bigger issue for you. The second one are these pathogens. So pathogens, the main one are these viral pathogens. So there's about 23 different viruses that are, mostly directly vectored by the Varroa mites, but some can be actually transmitted during queen mating. Some can be transmitted by using kind of old tools you're not disinfecting. And so these viruses are extremely virulent and extremely deadly to a honeybee colony. Now, unfortunately for a beekeeper, there's nothing you can do about the viruses. The only way you can control the viruses is really by controlling your viral levels. And so I'll talk about viruses a little bit more, but it's gonna be really important for you to know your viral levels, monitor, and treat them effectively. The third P is pesticides, which I'll talk about a little bit more later on. And so pesticides, there's different types of pesticides. Some are more toxic than other ones. But just know that if your bees are exposed to pesticides, that can lead to some colony losses. We also think about poor nutrition, so it's really vital and vitally important for your bees to have the great nutrition, have a diversity of pollen and nectar sources, and that not only supports overall colony health, but it helps your bees combat, the parasites and pathogens that your bees may have. And then finally, poor queens. So when you think about colony losses over the past, multiple decades, it really is multifaceted. It's really a combination of these different reasons, but it's mainly due to the parasites and pathogens. So, one thing I typically get this time of the year and probably in the next few months are these type of pictures. And so I'll get these pictures from beekeepers. They'll send me, oh, hey, my bees died. This is what it looks like. There's no bees left in the colony. They just got up and left. And what's tough is when I get these pictures, it's really hard for me to diagnose after the bees die. And that's one thing that we just have a problem with the industry in general. And that's one thing that we have issues with even new beekeepers is not knowing what's happening to your colonies beforehand before they actually die. Because if I get these pictures, it's really hard for me to look at these. Obviously the lighting isn't great and the pictures aren't great. But even if I were to inspect a colony, it's really hard for me to diagnose, a dead colony. So one thing I'll really promote and talk about is you really monitor your colonies throughout the year so you can figure out why your bees died before they actually die. And so one thing that's really important is to monitor your colonies early before they actually crash. And so, if you're monitoring your colonies, monthly, maybe every couple of weeks, and taking good measurements of your colonies and great inspections of your colonies and making sure you're writing down really great records, you can really diagnose why your bees die. So it's really important to monitor very early, make sure you know what you're looking for before you do an inspection, before your bees actually die. And one thing I'll be talking about are things that you should be looking for every single month during your beekeeping year, because it's really important to know what you're looking for instead of just kind of randomly going to the colony and just say, okay, I have a lot of bees in the colony, they must be healthy. There's certain things that you need to be looking for and being very proactive with during your colony inspections. So, hive inspections and diseases go hand in hand, because I'm going to talk about a few diseases. But for you, you may not know what these diseases look like. You may not know how to diagnose these diseases. And so one thing with hive inspections is you're sort of a bee detective. Your role is to really find what looks healthy and what doesn't look healthy. And if it doesn't look healthy, we have a lot of really great support to help you try to figure out what's actually happening. And so it's really important to take these hive inspections, but it's also more importantly to know what a healthy colony looks like so you can diagnose any unhealthy colonies. So when I talk about hive inspections, um, one thing I tell a lot of new beekeepers is you should absolutely be trying to inspect your colony, at least twice a month, maybe more often if you're a new beekeeper, and you're new to beekeeping and new to doing your hive inspections. So at the very least, you should be, inspecting your colonies, twice a month. Now, I just do my inspections once a month. But mainly because I sort of know what I'm looking for and I know how to diagnose things if there is an issue. But especially for new beekeepers, even if you have 1 year of experience, it's really important to inspect your colonies, twice a month if possible. Always try to keep your inspections very brief, under 10 minutes if possible. Now, obviously, that's probably impossible for new beekeepers. It may take you longer to inspect a colony and go through a colony, and so this may be somewhere between 30 to 40 minutes. But as you get more experience and as you, I guess, be more concerted in your inspections, you will be able to keep your inspections under 10 minutes. And also during your inspections, there should be certain things you should be focusing on within the colony. So number one is focusing on queen health, making sure you have a healthy, active egg laying, viable queen is really important. Focus on viral mites, making sure you know what your viral levels look like, knowing the threshold, and knowing whether or not you need to treat the colony's next is colony health. So, is your colony healthy? Is it strong? Is it bringing in a lot of nectar and pollen, or does it need some feeding? Things like that. And then finally, assessing the need for space. So, when you're inspecting your colonies, do you need more space to prevent any type of swarming? Do you need any type of space to prevent honey from going into the brood boxes, and becoming honey bound? And so, space is also something really important. And so, one thing I'll really talk about here are kind of helping you focus your inspections and be very conservative and knowing exactly what you're inspecting for before you actually enter the colony. And then next, really learning to identify any issues. So, I'll talk about different types of diseases and, you'll be able to diagnose these as you get more and more experience, but really understanding what a healthy colony looks like. So, if something looks a little bit off, if something looks a little funny, maybe your colony has a weird scent or smell to it, you're going to be able to identify some of those issues. And then finally, most importantly, taking really good records. If you're taking good records throughout the year and your colony dies, you could send the inspection report to us. We can help you identify the issue. And it kind of goes into what I was mentioning earlier. If your bees die and you send pictures of that, it's really hard for us to figure out what's happening. But if you take really good records and you take thorough inspections, we can help you make those changes and prevent any losses in the future. So one thing that we have are these hive tags. It's really important to keep track of your colonies. Beekeepers do this a lot of different ways. I like these personalized tags. I think they work really well. I do have a tag printer here, so we're able to print personalized tags. Cattle tags also work really well because when you're taking really good records, it's really important to know what inspections are connected to which colonies. And one thing I'll note here is one benefit of being part of the Master Beekeeping program is we print these tags for each beekeeper in the program. They can staple these tags directly on their colony, and then we have we will have an interface online where you can enter your data and see what your colonies look like, but more importantly, compare your colonies to other beekeepers across the state. Because you may be just inspecting your colonies and may know what your colonies look like, but it's really hard to figure out if your colonies are healthy or not unless you compare them to other beekeepers. And so one of our goals is to teach beekeepers on how to use these tags on their colonies, have an online interface so you can compare your colonies to other states. So, maybe if you use this program, for example, as part of the Master Beekeeping program, you may have the highest mite levels in the state. And so by comparing your colonies to other beekeepers, you may say, okay, I think I have a problem here. I should probably do something about this. Or maybe you have the smallest colonies in the state, so you may have to do some more practices for that. So this will be a really helpful program to help you go into your second year. And what's gonna be really cool is if you do this every single year, you can keep really good records of your colonies throughout time and see, okay, maybe a couple years ago we had some issues because of this versus now, and these are the things that have changed that seem to be working. But yeah, I mean, if you're part of the Master Beekeeping Program, we provide takes to all the beekeepers. This is an inspection sheet that I use, and I'm happy to share this with you guys afterwards. Um, it seems very complicated, but it's a really straightforward workflow and allows you to do a really quick inspection and know exactly what you should be looking for. So you can either use this inspection sheet or make your own inspection sheet. But these are things that I'm always looking for, and these are things that most experienced beekeepers are looking for across the state. And so one thing I'll go over during hive inspections are these different metrics that you'll be measuring, that you really should be measuring on your colony. So for example, the colony ID numbers, if you have a tag on your colony or some kind of identification on your colony, you put that tag right here. Colony configuration just means how many boxes you have in your colony. So D means maybe you have two deep boxes, M means maybe you have multiple medium boxes. Queen status tells you, did you find the queen? Did you see the queen? Did you mark the queen? And if you did mark the queen, is it the same queen from beforehand? And this gives you information about whether or not you had any queen events. Frames of bees tells you how large your colony is, and I'll talk about that. Brood pattern tells you how well the queen's doing, how well she's laying. And then diseases are different diseases that you're likely to see within a colony. And so if you see those, you would circle those. And so this is a very straightforward inspection sheet. And it's connected to our future online program where you could fill out the sheet, enter the data online, and it allows you to compare your colonies to other beekeepers. And what's great about this is if beekeepers in the program use this, it's standardized and allows you to compare your colonies to other beekeepers in your county, in your region, or even in your state. Okay, so before I begin my hive inspections, I always begin at the hive entrance. I think you could tell a lot by the health and the viability of the colony by simply standing a few feet in front of the colony entrance and taking a look at the colony. And so one thing I'm looking for is there active bee activity? So are the bees actively flying in and out of the colony? Do they have pollen on their back of their legs? So that's one thing I'm looking for. Are the bees bearding up? So maybe there's a lack of space in the colony. I'm also looking for any dead bees in the front entrance. So if you start seeing a lot of dead bees in the front entrance, that could be a sign of diseases before you get into the colony. And so this may tell you that, hey, you may need to do a more thorough inspection to figure out what's happening and try to kind of alleviate those type of issues. Next is to, prepare and apply smoke. And so I only apply maybe two puffs of smoke. More if the colonies are really aggressive. But, one thing you don't want to do is over smoke the colony. Next is remove any boxes. So when I'm doing my hive inspection, I'm trying to get to at least two brood frames. If I inspect two frames of a mixture of capped and open brood, I can tell everything about the health of the colony. So what that means is I don't have to go through all 20 or 40 frames. If I pull out those two frames, I can tell a lot about the health of the colony, the health of the queen, and any type of Varroa infestation there is. Make sure not to crush a queen, and then once you're finished with your inspection, which hopefully is under 10 minutes if possible, close the hive carefully and move on. So as beekeeper, right, I like to view beekeepers as a bee detective. And so as a bee detective, you want to go into your colony and figure out if there's anything wrong with your colony, and if not, you can move on from that. But it's really important to know the signs of a colony that's unhealthy and isn't doing well. So like I mentioned before I get into the colony, the first thing I always look for is the front of the colony. So, obviously active bee activity, bearding, a lot of bees coming in and out of the colony, that's a good sign of a really healthy, strong colony. But if you see a lack of bee activity and you see piles of dead bees in the front entrance, that could be a sign of a major issue within your colony, and that may mean that you need to do a more thorough inspection within the colony. And even the bottom board, you can see some signs of disease on the bottom board. So this is a fungal pathogen, which I'll talk about briefly. Um, and it tends to form these kind of mummies. And so this fungus basically encapsulate the larva, turn them into mummies, and then they kind of push to the bottom board. So if you start seeing disease at the bottom board and dead bees in the front, that's a sign of a disease. Next is really to examine brood. Now, you may not know what these different diseases look like, and I really don't expect you to know what they look like. But one thing I do say is if you know what healthy brood looks like, you can diagnose that something looks unhealthy or there may be some issues within the colony. And so this is sort of a picture of a healthy colony. You can see the different stages of brood development. You see everything from really, eggs to young larvae to older larvae plus caproot. The larvae are in a clear C shape, they're white pearly color, and more importantly, most of the cells are filled with these brood. And so to me, if I'm doing an inspection and I'm looking at those two brood frames, this is exactly what I'm looking for. One, I know that there's a queen in the colony because I see eggs. I see all the different stages of brood development. They're a really white pearly color. So to me, this is a really good sign of a healthy, strong colony. But if you start seeing something like this, and this is probably the most advanced sign of a bacterial infection I've ever seen. But if you start seeing larvae that may be a little discolored, not in that C shape, maybe they're scaling at the bottom. If you start seeing anything like this, even if it's only a few larvae, that's a sign that there's some disease. And you may not know what that disease actually is, but if you can take a good picture, you can send it to our office, and we're happy to help you with your next steps. But it's really important to know what healthy looks like so you can diagnose anything that looks unhealthy. And one thing I always bring out to the field, and you would be surprised how often you use tweezers or forceps. Because sometimes it is hard to see inside the frames, especially if you don't have great eyesight. And so I always go to you can go to Walmart, you can go to Amazon, you can go to different stores and buy these tweezers. And what you can do is you can pull out a larva that looks healthy and a larva that doesn't look healthy, put it on the cover, and that allows you to see exactly if there are differences, and also take pictures that you can send to our lab. So you would be surprised how often you use tweezers, and it's something I recommend all beekeepers having with them. And honestly, they're really cheap. Next is diagnosing any adult diseases. So most of the diseases you will be seeing will be on the larval stages, but there are some diseases and pathogens you may be seeing that are affecting the adult stages. And so this is a sort of a picture of healthy workers. The one thing you should be seeing is, especially on the brood frames, and one reason we really stress at brood frames is because this is where all the nurse bees are, the young bees, and if you see any issue with them, that's going to lead to maybe crashes in the future. So when I'm looking at my workers, the one thing I always look for is the back of the thorax. Do they have a lot of hair? Because some of these diseases cause the bees to become hairless. So are you seeing a lot of hair? Am I seeing their wings fully intact? Are there plenty of bees in the colony? These are all, signs of healthy adult worker bees. But if you start seeing signs like this, so this is a worker that has deformed wing virus. You can see the wings are fully crippled up. This bee will probably die in the next few days or so. And so even if you see one bee with deformed wing virus, that is a huge, huge sign that there's a bigger issue within your colony. And also, even if you pick up this bee, you'll see probably a mite at the bottom of this bee. You'll see that this bee starting to become a little hairless. You can see this kind of bald spot on the back of the bee. This bee is also grayish color, and it's also smaller. So if you compare this healthy worker versus this unhealthy worker, you can see a clear difference between them. And so it's really important to know what a healthy worker looks like so you can diagnose any diseases on the adults. Okay, so one thing I like to always promote to beekeepers is grading colony size. And so how do you measure how large your colony is? Colony size is probably the most important metric for measuring colony health, colony productivity, and things like this. It's also a really easy thing that every beekeeper should be doing. So if you think about your colony configuration, right, frames of bees is a way for measuring how large your colony actually is. And so what we typically do is we look at how many frames are in the colony. So I'd assume that most of you are managing lengths with colonies, 10 frame equipment, but even some of you may be managing, top bar colony or long lengths with colonies. It really doesn't matter. You just have to know how many frames are in your colony to really estimate and predict how large your colony actually is. So when I do a frame of bee count, what I'll typically do is I'll look at the top of the box. I'll look at the top of each box. And one thing I'll look for is how many frames are fully covered or even partially covered with bees. So this is a box that's 10 frame equipment. I think there's one, two, three. Yeah, so it's 10 frame equipment, but there's only 9 frames in the colony. And so when I'm looking at it, I'm looking at how many frames are full of bees. And so if I'm doing a frame count on this, I see that this is probably half, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. So probably about eight and a half frames of bees. And so this is how I'd grade this colony, and I do this for every single box, and I add those numbers up. And this may seem very subjective. This may seem like it's not very accurate, but it's actually a very, very accurate way of measuring how many bees are actually in the colony. And so if a deep frame, right, like if you have deep equipment and your frame is at full size, a partially covered frame will have somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 bees. If it's mostly covered, about 75%, 1,500 to 2,000 bees. And if it's fully covered, like this one right in the middle, this has about 2,500 to 3,000 bees within it. And so, this is a really accurate and fast way to measure how large your colony actually is. So if I'm looking at this, right? So these are two different colonies. This is colony A, this is colony B, and this is how I would measure frames of bees. So, this is fully covered, so this would be 1 frame, 2 frames, 3 frames, 4 frames, 5 frames. So about 5.5 frames of bees. So, to me, 5.5 frames of bees is a really good number to have in the spring. But if you have 5.5 frames of bees in the middle of July or into August when you're pulling your honey, that's a sign that your colony is not doing very well. And so, that's why it's really important to know how large your colony is because, if you have a colony health report and you're showing me that your frames of bees is less than 5 frames of bees throughout the entire year, that's a huge sign for me that there's a major issue. Now, if you look at this one, these ones are all partially covered. So this would be maybe a half frame that equal one, 1.5. So maybe about two frames of bees or so. So this colony is really small, and this colony may not do very well, and it may not thrive very well. But also, this may be from a nucleus colony, so that's why the context really matters. So in the spring, this may not be so bad, but if you have this, right around now, and this is how your bees look right now, there's probably a low chance that colony can actually make it through the winter. And so, if I were to get a report from you about a colony looking like this right around now, I may tell you that you should probably combine this colony with this colony because this one has a lower chance of actually making it, and that's the only way you can salvage your bees. Okay, so really a quick pop quiz. I think I can see some chats in here. So, if you were going to measure frames of bees, what type of number would you put on this colony? And we're just looking at this one box. This may have multiple boxes, but if you just have a single deep, just like this, how many frames of bees would this be? I don't know if I can see the chat.
You're
Okay,
getting answers like 8, 9, 8.5, 9.5.
perfect.
Yeah, eight's in somewhere between 8 and 9.
Exactly, exactly. So you guys all kind of came to the kind of the same conclusion. Like anything with this, there's always gonna be a little bit of variation. How I'd probably mark would be, this would probably be, and it's kind of tough to see from a picture, but I call this one maybe a half. So 1.5, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, so about 9. So 8.5, 9, those are all really great answers. And so this is a really simple, easy thing that any beekeeper can do. Okay, we'll do one more. And I'm not showing you the full box. These are the only frames that actually have bees in them. And I can see the chat now. 4. So I'm seeing 4, 3, 4.5, 3 to 4. Yep, Jay said 5, 4.5. Yep, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I'd probably say this is about 5.5, 5.5, something like that. But one thing to note, if you're doing the measurements every single time, then your scale is going to be based on how you're measuring it, right? So, this is a really easy way to actually grade your colonies. And And I've taught beekeepers and I've seen beekeepers do this, and one thing they always tell me, this is probably the most important thing that they can teach any beekeeper, is actually grading your colony and grading how large your colony actually is. And also, there's some standard, the standard sizes of bees that we would expect in Texas throughout the given year. So, for example, if you do start using our online program, we can, tell you that, hey, your colonies are smaller than they should be this time of the year. You may need to feed, you may need to do something else to deal with your colonies. And so frame count is a really easy way to measure how large your colony actually is and how healthy they are. So next thing I always measure is a brood pattern. So brood pattern is a way to measure how well your queen's doing and whether she's missing any spots when she's laying eggs. Now, now, brew pattern is sort of a tough one sometimes, and so this one takes a little bit more experience because your frame could have pollen that's stored, your frame could have nectar that's stored that could be influencing the brew pattern. But brew pattern still is a pretty good way of measuring how well your queen's actually doing and whether or not you should be thinking about requeening or changing out your queen. And so this example of five. Typically, we're rating our brew pattern from a scale from 1 to 5. Five being a really solid brood pattern, not many missing spots, so the queen's doing very well, and the workers are taking care of that brood so they can actually become capped. One would be a very spotty brood pattern. So maybe the queen's missing a few spots. Maybe that brood's being cannibalized because there's a lack of pollen or nectar in the area. There's a lot of reason for a spotty brood pattern. It's really not always the queen, but can be sign of some larger issue within the colony. So, if you're looking at a frame like this is what you really want. And it's very rare to have a frame just like this. I've graded thousands and thousands of colonies, and I've only given out a few fives. Maybe I'm just a tough grader, but it's really rare to have a really solid brood pattern like this. But you do want to have a pattern that has very few missing spots, um, and the queen's laying very, very steadily in a regular solid pattern. So that last picture was a five. This is how it would rank like a one. So you can see that the cap brood is very spotty. There's a lot of missing spots. I see a lot of older larvae. And so in this situation, there was actually a queen issue, a queen event. So you see a lot of older larvae, but the queen was replaced or starting to fail. Um, One thing you also see is maybe diseases. So if you start seeing a lot of diseases, if you see a lot of damage from the Varroa mite, you'll start seeing a very spotted brood pattern like this. So this can tell you a lot about the health of the colony. Whereas this is a three, this is about an average. And one thing to know here about brood pattern is sometimes it can be influenced by the pollen and nectar coming into the colony. So you see kind of on the outside, there's a lot of pollen stored here. It may not be the best picture, but this is probably also influencing the brood pattern. Okay, so if you guys were to rate this brood pattern, how would you rank it from 1 to 5? Pull this up. Okay, so we see twos, 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 threes, one. Yeah, I'd probably agree with a two. Um, but yeah, one reason I like to show this picture is one, there's a very clear pattern of pollen that's stored. I don't see any pollen right in the middle. But that can also influence it. But one thing that I typically do is when I pull out two brood frames just like this, I typically take an average of multiple frames because there may be maybe one frame that's very spotty like this and another frame that's very, very solid. So it's really important to look at, at least two frames on each side. But to me, this is very concerning. It's a very poor brood pattern. I don't know what the larva or eggs look like in this situation, but this could be a sign that something's happening to your queen and you may need to deal with it. And one thing that I guess you can't really zoom in here, but if you look right here, there's actually a disease right here that's causing the poor brood pattern. So, the queen's laying very well, but there's diseases within the colony, and that's leading to the larvae dying before they're actually able to get capped and reach their full development. And so a poor brood pattern can represent not only the queens, but also diseases. Okay, let's do this one. And this is why I say that, measuring brood pattern can be really difficult because each frame's a little different. This one's just packed with honey around it, right? But if you look at the middle, I mean, the brood pattern is very solid. Yeah, so I see a lot of fours. So if you look at just a brood that's being laid, which is what you should be focused on, yeah, I'd probably give this a 4. It's a very good brood pattern, even though it's not filling the entire frame. The brood pattern is doing very well, and I think this colony is, I mean, obviously successful because it's bringing in a lot of nectar and honey. Okay, next, it's really important to know your queen status. Not only tracking your queens over time, but also tracking how well your queen's actually doing. So queens are probably the most important bee within the colony, right? The queen is the only one laying eggs within the colony. She'll lay somewhere between 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day, even more in some situations. And she also produces, certain pheromones that, alert the rest of the colony that, hey, we have a queen in the colony that's doing really well, and we should, support her. She's also producing pheromones that on the eggs, such as the workers are bringing in resources, and so the queen's really important for the entire colony. Now, just like any insect, just like any person, right? As you age, things can start deteriorating. And so with the queen, as the queen gets older, you might start seeing more signs of queen issues. And that's one reason it's become pretty standard by especially commercial beekeepers to requeen and change their queens out every single year. And so when you talk about brood pattern, this is exactly the type of brood pattern we're looking for. This is a healthy queen. This is a brood pattern of a 5. The queen's doing very well. She's not missing many spots. So this is exactly what we're looking for. Now, you take an inspection of this one. This brood pattern's maybe a 1.5, maybe a 2. Um, it's very spotty. But the one thing to note here too is not only has a poor brood pattern, but you see a lot of these drone cappings right in the middle. Now, your colonies will always produce drones, but if you see in the middle of a brood frame just like this, and you see a mixture of workers and drones, this is a sign that your queen's probably running out of sperm, and she's laying a mixture of fertilized eggs, which will become worker, and unfertilized eggs, which will be males. And so this is a clear sign of a failing queen, and this is a sign that you should probably at least replace your queen as soon as possible because once she runs out of sperm, then that colony can never produce a new queen again. So next thing if you guys see a poor brew pattern, and you start seeing a signs of a failing queen potentially, the next thing I always look for is a more thorough inspection of the queen. So I try to find the queen, and I want to see how her actual wings look like. Because one thing with beekeeping, if you can understand the behaviors and why bees behave, they'll tell you everything about the health and how well the colony is actually doing. So this is what the queen should be. This is what the queen should look like. You see the wings are fully intact. There's no tatter on the wings. There's no bite marks on the wings. There's a full set of hair kind of around the queen. So to me, this is a really high quality queen. Whereas this is an example of the failing queen from the previous frame. You can see that her wings are tattered. This wing is actually half chewed out because the workers are aggressively chewing at her, trying to replace her and trying to get rid of her. And so, the workers are basically telling you that they don't like the queen and they want to replace the queen because she's having some sort of issues. And so, if you start seeing anything like this with the queens, and you'll see natural aging on the queen wings, but we see something where the workers are aggressively biting at the queen, you may want to think about requeening the colony. Next, I always look for is the retinue. So these are workers that are surrounding the queen, they're grooming the queen, they're making sure that she's doing very well. And there's typically a tendance of maybe 10 to 15 bees that are constantly surrounding the queen. And so you can see these workers are surrounding the queen, they're licking her, and they're taking care of her. Whereas this example of a failing queen, the workers are not only biting at the queen and being aggressive towards the queen, but they're not forming that clear retinue around the queen. And so this is a sign that, the workers don't like the queen, so you as a beekeeper shouldn't like that queen also. Now, one thing I'll know about retinue, it's not always the most accurate way of measuring how well the queen's doing. So sometimes beekeepers over smoke their colonies. So when you smoke your colonies too much, that causes the bees to be really, really runny. It's really hard for you to tell whether there's a clear retinue or not. But if you don't smoke at all and you see queen wing damage, you see a poor brood pattern, you see the workers biting at the queen, this is a sign of some queen issues. Next is really understanding what a queen cell is and different types of queen cells. This will tell you about the history of the colony and things you should be doing proactively to take care of your colony. So this is an example of an emergency queen cells. So you can see that there's about 10 or 15 queen cells. It's surrounded by nectar. There's no eggs or larvae in the colony. And this is a sign that the queen has suddenly died or maybe actually killed or crushed that queen. And so if you start seeing this, this probably means that your queen suddenly died for some reason. The colony's trying to raise queens as fast as possible. You may see some supersedure cells, especially if you see a failing queen. So if you see the queen in the colony, you see eggs and larvae in the colony, you may see a few of these supersedure cells. And what this means is the colony is trying to retire that queen and replace that queen with a new queen. And so they may be biting at the queen, but they won't replace her until they actually have a new queen within the colony. And so in these type of situations, you actually may see two queens in the colony, but eventually that older queen will be replaced and this new queen will take over. Then you also have these swarm cells. So these are cells that are typically built on the bottom of the frame. And this is a sign that your colony is about to, I guess, essentially reproduce. So half the workforce is going to fly out, find a new home, and move on to some location about 3 miles away. And so if you start seeing swarm cells like this, you may have to do some intervention as soon as possible before they become an issue. And if your cells are open like this, well, your colony is probably about to swarm or has already swarmed. So it's really important to know the different types of queen cells. And then finally, diseases, which I'll get into. So, you know, one reason you may, so a lot of you, this may be your first year of beekeeping, and so you may have a brand new queen from probably April or May or so, and so your queen probably did very well this first year. But as your queens get older and older and older, you may see issue with colony size, but you also may see more diseases because your queen isn't as healthy or as young as she used to be. And so typically with a really young queen, you'll see healthy brood, you see a lack of diseases, but as your queens get older, you may see more of these diseases along with it. So it's just something to consider, and that's one reason that beekeepers do replace queens every single year. Um, but also, if you start seeing diseases, there's some queen genetics that allow the bees to deal with these diseases. And so, one thing I would say is, if you start seeing things like this, you may want to queen your colony with a more hygienic queen. So when you're doing your inspection sheets, this is how I track my queens. This is pretty standard across the entire world, and so this is the best way, in my opinion, to really track your queens and track them over time. So if you're doing an inspection and you find that there's no queen in the colony and the queen's been replaced, or there's queen cells in the colony and there's no active laying queen, I put queenless or QL for queenless. If you know that there's a queen, so you see eggs, but you don't find the queen, you put QR for queen right. So there's a queen, but you did not see that queen. If you see the queen, you put QS for queen seam, dead for the queen and the colony are dead. If you kill the queen, so let's say you in a situation you don't like the queen, you want to replace the queen, you can put QK for queen killed. QNS just means the queen is not seen, and you're not sure if the colony is queenless or not. DL means it's a drone layer, new queen, and so there's different like standardized ways of marking the queen status of your colony. And one thing you can also do is, and what I typically do is I put a mark next to it. So if I mark the queen like blue for this example or a different color, I'll put QS-Y for yellow or QS-B for blue. And this allows me to know that, if I do inspection a month later and I find a blue queen, that I know that's the same queen in that colony. It allows me to keep track of the queen age and keep track of the queen within the colony. Okay, so if we're looking at this example, this quick pop quiz, what would be the queen status of this? So you're inspecting the colony, you find the queen. What would you put in this situation for, let's say this one right here, this queen on the far left. Yep, QS. Yeah, so I'd probably put QS-G for green, QS-R for red, and then QS-W for white. So I know that one, I found the queen, and one, the queen is actually marked. Okay, now we'll get into the pest pathogens and diseases. And so one thing I did talk about is, you're doing a hive inspection, right? And the first part of this talk was really how to do a hive inspection, how to measure how large a colony is, how to look at brood pattern, and how to assess your actual queen quality and how well your queen's actually doing. And so the next part, I'll be kind of talking about the pest pathogen diseases that you may see as a beekeeper. Now, some of these, you as a beekeeper, even if you do this for the next 5 to 15 years, you may never see some of these diseases ever, but you may see them. So I'm hoping to give you some guidance on, one, what do they look like and what should you be doing in that situation? So first, I always like to talk about Varroa mites, and so Varroa mites are a global problem. It's something that everywhere in the world deals with. Except I guess there's two places in the world that do not currently have Varroa mites. One is Antarctica, so we'll throw that one out. But there's one more place in the world that doesn't have Varroa mites currently. Any guesses? No guesses? Okay. The only place is Labrador, Canada, which is actually surprising. So actually, a couple of years ago, Australia, um, actually got varroa mites for the very first time. So Labrador, Canada is the only place in the world that doesn't have varroa mites, and so this is means that you as a beekeeper is something that not only you have to deal with, but beekeepers across the entire world have to deal with. And just a little bit of history about the varroa mites. So, varroa mites are these small parasitic mites, and their original host was this different species of honeybees called Apis cerana. And so Apis cerana is found in Southeast Asia, and the varroa mites were on these bees for a very long time, for multiple decades. And around 1910, 1912 or so, the Varroa mites actually jumped host from Apis cerana onto Apis mellifera. Now, Apis mellifera is the European honeybee, the Western honeybee that we all manage. And, one thing that we love about them is their honey production and their pollination services. So they jumped host onto Apis mellifera, and ever since then, they made its way out west into the United States. So around 1987, the Varroa mites were first found in Florida, and now it's found everywhere in the entire United States. And so this is one thing to know is that Varroa mites are a really big issue, something you all have to deal with, and this would be your number one priority as a first year beekeeper or even into your 15th year beekeeper. We all have to deal with this, and it's a really hard problem to deal with. So this kind of shows you the history of Varroa mites. So this map hasn't been updated. I need to make a brand new one because it says there's no infestation in Australia. But as you can see, just kind of migration of Varroa mites across the entire world. So first being found in 1904 in Indonesia, and then over the past 70 years or so, and now it's found in every part of the entire world. So this is a global problem, and it's been a really difficult problem to deal with as beekeepers. So I do want to touch on just kind of the life cycle of varroa mites because it's really important to know this in order to figure out how you want to deal with and how you want to treat and manage the varroa mites. So there's really two different stages of the varroa life cycle. So we have what we like to call the phoretic stage. The phoretic stage is a stage where the varroa mites are on the back of the bees. They're basically backpacks on the back of the bees, and they're transmitted throughout the colony and even to other colonies. Now, this phoretic stage, these are the future foundress mites. They're feeding on the fat body, or they're feeding on the bloodstream of the bee. They're getting ready to actually jump into cell and reproduce. Once they are ready to actually start laying eggs and reproducing, they jump into the cells of about fifth instar larva. So this is when the larvae are really large and right before they're actually capped. And about a few hours later, after they're capped, yeah, that's when the mice jump into the cells. And so mice are really smart in that way. They're really good about hiding inside the cells, and when they're hiding inside the cells, one, that makes treatments unable to actually kill mites inside the cells, but two, the bees are unable to find the mites and kill them that way. After the larva reaches a prepupa stage, so it starts spinning cocoon, this is when the mite starts feeding on the prepupa, and this is when they prepare to lay eggs. Once they reach about the purple-eyed, pink-eyed pupa stage, this is when the mites lay eggs. So they'll lay one female and one male. Those siblings will mate with each other, produce future mites, and those mites will emerge and start the process over again. And so one thing to know is the majority of mites within your colony are going to be hiding inside your cell. And so even if you don't see the mites, they're there, they're hiding, and when they're inside the cells, they're really hard to manage. And so as I get into ways to treat and manage your varroa mites, the easiest and fastest way to kill the mites are the ones on the back of the bees because there's a lot of treatments that can kill mites on the back of the bees. But when they're hiding inside the brood cells, there's no way for you as a beekeeper to kill them. So just know that you may be killing the mites in the back of the back of the bees, but when your colony is actually, capped and your frames are capped just like this, there's no way for you to kill that brood. And so as I talk about different strategies to manage Varroa mites, you as a beekeeper need to, one, artificially push these mites out of the cells, so make the colonies broodless, or two, you need to target times of the year when your colonies don't have any brood. So that's the most effective way and most powerful way to kill the mites. Now, when are your colonies naturally broodless? Probably right around now. So probably in the next few weeks, probably into, November. So right around early November into, mid-January. This is when your colonies are naturally broodless because your queen's not laying eggs anymore. Your colonies are going through the winter, and so there's no cap brood in your colony. And so when your colonies are broodless like this, all your mites are unable to jump in the cells, so they're all on the back of the workers. And so as I talk about different treatments, this is the most effective way of killing your mites. Now we get into the spring, so let's say you're going to your second year of beekeeping. Your colony is also going to be broodless probably late January, early February. This is also a really great time to target your mites and kill your mites before the summer actually happens because, if you can keep your mite levels really low in the spring, they won't become a problem right around now because this is when the mites become a big problem and sort of a point of no return. So it's really important to target those broodless periods. You can also artificially make broodless periods by caging your queen and eliminating her or stopping her from actually laying large amounts of eggs. And so, if you take anything away from this conversation, really knowing that, if you're treating for viral mites, you have to target these broodless periods and push all the mites out in order to effectively kill them. So one thing when I talk about Varroa life cycle is it's very connected to your colony life cycle. So, one thing when I talked about earlier was measuring how large a colony is. This is not only important to know how healthy a colony is, but as your colonies get bigger and bigger and bigger, your Varroa levels get bigger also. So that means that the larger the colonies you have, the larger the mites are within that single colony. And so when you're targeting your Varroa management, I always split my colonies into these four different stages. I think this is the most effective way to look at a colony throughout a given year. So in stage one, this is November to January. Your colonies are going through the winter. They're kind of in dormancy. The queen's not laying eggs. Your colonies are also effectively broodless. So this is also when you should be managing your Varroa mites, which have different strategies then. Around stage two, this is when your colony begins to grow and get larger. But remember, as your colonies get bigger and as your colony grows, your Varroa levels grow along with it. So just know that if you're not treating them and you're not knocking down these mite levels back, that your colony will get bigger and your Varroa levels will get bigger also. Then we get stage three. This is when your colony reaches its maximum size, probably somewhere around 15 to 20 frames of bees. Um, but also, this is also when your colony starts getting smaller and preparing for the winter. So right around now, you're kind of in stage four. And so if you didn't manage your viral levels at all, you can see that your colonies are going down, but your viral levels have kind of surpassed that curve. And this is when you start seeing massive losses due to the viral mites. So it's really important to know these different stages and making sure to know when to knock down and how to knock down your viral mites. But more importantly, it's really important to knock them down early on because if you're treating mites during stage one and stage two, they won't follow this massive growth curve and become a problem at stage three. And these are the different things you may see within your colony. These are different things you may see that are causing your colony losses that are directly related to Varroa levels. So number one is co-infections. So this is a very, very common pathogen called European foul brood. If you have high Varroa levels in the colony, you may start seeing this. And so this is actually separate from Varroa mites, but what happens is this is a co-infection. So when your Varroa levels get really high in your colony, they become really stressed. They have a lot of viruses, they have less workforce, and you start seeing more of these bacterial infections popping up. And so I do get pictures like this from beekeepers, and they ask me, okay, I need to get antibiotics to treat this bacterial infection. But if you're not treating the root of the problem, which is viral mites, then antibiotics are not going to do you any good. It's still going to be a persistent problem. So, if you do a hive inspection and you see these diseases like this, the root of the problem may not actually be that disease, but probably due to the viral mites. You also may see different signs of brood diseases. So this is one I'll talk about a little bit later on, but it's called parasitic mite syndrome. You start seeing a bunch of sunken down cells. You see a few mites in the cells. You see a bunch of mite frass or poop inside the cells. And this is when your colonies crash. This is also a point of no return. So I typically see this probably around August, September in Texas. And when you see this, your colonies have about a 1% chance of making it. So that's why it's really important to be proactive because if you get to this point, there's not much you can do. And then also you might start seeing these viral infections. So deformed wing virus is the most common one, the most virulent type of virus, and the reason why your colonies are probably going to crash. And even if you see one bee with deformed wing virus, that that means that there's a larger issue within your colony. Okay, so these are the different signs of Varroa. So throughout a year, the Varroa, I guess the Varroa damage, we like to call it the Varroasis, which is a Varroa disease, it progresses over time. And so this is sort of the progression of the Varroa damage over time. So you might start seeing mites on the back of the bees or underneath the bees. This does not necessarily mean a big issue, but means that there are mites in the colony, which we all have. As the mites get higher inside the colony, you start seeing the symptom known as chew down brood. So what's happening is the mites are inside the cell, they're feeding on the pupa, and the bees know that there's mites inside the cell. And so one way they're dealing with it and combating it is by actually cannibalizing the pupa and trying to get rid of the mites and disrupt their reproduction. And so oftentimes one of the earliest stages of Varroa damage is what we call chew down brood. And this can be really hard to see as a new beekeeper, and that's one reason I always bring forceps into the field because I can pull them out and see, okay, the workers have already started cannibalizing the head and the thorax of the bee. This is a bigger issue. Um, and so you may see a few cells, but over time you'll see hundreds of cells that are chewed down just like this. The third progressed damage of real mites is deformed wing virus. So you may see one bee with deformed wing virus, but as it gets worse, you may see hundreds and hundreds of bees with this deformed wing virus. And like I mentioned, if you only see one, that means you need to do something as soon as possible because there's no way for you to treat viruses. And so once your virus is out of control, there's sort of a point of no return. So that's why it's really important to take immediate intervention if you see this. And then finally, the final stage of real levels, this is when you start seeing colony crashes. This is when you start seeing colony deaths, and this is a disease known as parasitic mite syndrome, which I mentioned. And so if you see this, there's not much you can do as a beekeeper. It's really too late. You know, you should have been more proactive when you saw these earlier signs. But when you start seeing these last two signs, it's gonna be really hard for you to actually save that colony. And so that's why anything with this type of management, it's really extremely important to be proactive instead of reactive. And starting at phase two and phase one and two in the spring and the winter before it becomes a big issue right around now. And some of you guys actually may see this within your colonies right now. And there's not much you can do in that situation. I wish there's a way we could treat and help the colonies out, but this is a point where you kind of live and learn, and then hopefully you can take care of it next year. This is a picture that I get a lot from beekeepers right around now. A lot of beekeepers tell me, "Hey, wax moth killed my colonies." I see a lot of wax moth. So as I get into secondary pests like wax moth and small hive beetle, these are the pests that move in after your colony actually dies. So wax moth never kills your colonies. Small hive beetle never kills your colonies. But what they do is they're secondary pests and move in after your colony actually crashes. And so you look at this frame, this is a very common frame. One thing I see is one wax moth. So this beekeeper told me that wax moth killed their colonies. But when I take a closer look at it, one, I see a bunch of sunken down brood. You can't really see it right here, but that's not a parasitic mite syndrome. But you see all these kind of like little white specks. You see these white specks right here? That's all mite poop. So I get these pictures all the time, and I see all these white specks that are kind of illuminating inside the frame. I'm like, okay, these bees died due to the mites, and the beekeepers blaming it on wax moths. So, you know, this is one way I can diagnose that's really a mite issue. But if you start seeing these kind of white specks in here, that means it's just packed full of this mite poop, and the mites became an issue. But one thing to note here too is that um, if you have multiple colonies in your yard and one colony crashes due to mites and looks just like this, just knowing that these colonies are known as mite bombs. What that means is there's an explosion of mites. So when this colony crashes, the mites don't just disappear, the bees don't just disappear, they just kind of move on to other colonies. So that means that if you aren't treating even one colony properly, those mites will explode and spread to all your colonies, and they can even spread to your neighbors' colonies. So that's why it's really vitally important to manage your viral levels because that may not only cause issue with your one colony, but to your other colonies and to your neighbors' colonies. Okay, so we talked a lot about mites, the life cycle, and the points where you should be thinking about managing mites. But the next thing is think about how you actually want to monitor your Varroa levels. So there's three different ways to monitor your Varroa levels. We have, number one, a powdered sugar roll, number two, an alcohol wash, and then number three, CO2 method. So I would say if you're measuring your viral levels, and I'll talk about different thresholds, it's really important to be as accurate as possible. And so one reason that beekeepers don't want to monitor their mites is they don't want to kill their bees. It's sort of a requirement to kill your bees in order to know where your mite levels are. But, one thing I tell beekeepers is it's better to, take a biopsy of your colony instead of lose your entire colony. And so one reason that beekeepers use a powdered sugar roll to kind of monitor their viral levels is mainly because they don't want to kill the bees. So what they do is they collect 300 bees, they put into a jar, and they put about 1 or 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar on it. That powdered sugar causes the bees to flap their wings and shake the bees off, and then you're able to shake those bees and put them back into the colony. Um, but one problem with this method here is, especially here in Texas and certain parts of Texas, it can get really humid. So when it gets really humid, that sugar starts clumping up and your accuracy dips pretty far. So you may have a 70% accuracy. And when you're relying on a threshold, you don't want any false negatives. You don't want anything that's telling you that, hey, my levels are good, even though they're actually really bad or really high. And so that's why I tell and I really push beekeepers to do an alcohol wash. Alcohol wash is really the gold standard. It's 99% accuracy, and it gets rid of any of those kind of false negatives that you may have. So, this is a device called the Easy Mite Check. You can buy it at any type of bee supply store, and this is, in my opinion, a requirement for all beekeepers if you want to keep your bees alive from year one into year five. It's also really cheap. I think about $20 to $30, and you only need to buy it one time. So what you'll do is you'll get a half cup of bees. A half cup of bees is 300 bees. You put that into this device. You put about you can put 30% alcohol. You can use windshield wiper fluid. You can even use soapy water. You shake it for about a minute or so, and then you count the number of mites at the bottom. So you see all these red dots right here. These are all mites. So this actually had, I think, about 30 mites or so. Um, and so if I do 30 mites from 300 bees, I divide that by 3, so I get 10 mites per 100 bees. So as you get into threshold, that's really high, and you should be managing and do something as soon as possible. CO2, this used to be on the market, but actually Vito Farmer just took it off. I never found this to be accurate, so I wouldn't rely on this. So, this I'll say like these are your options, but I would really push you to do an alcohol wash if possible. And like I mentioned, it's really important to sacrifice the bees for the betterment of the entire colony. And just remember that, these 300 bees are being replaced by the colony probably every couple hours. And so it's not going to hurt your colony at all. And it's better to sacrifice a few hundred bees, now rather than losing all 20 to 30,000 bees. So it's a really important way to prevent any colony death. So these are the thresholds that we typically recommend. We're working on kind of modifying these thresholds, but this is sort of the gold standard thresholds we've been using for a very long time. And so from February to July, you want somewhere between 1 mite per 100 bees or less. And then right around July and October, right around now, you want somewhere between 3 mites or less of per 100 bees. So I would rely on these thresholds. And one thing I do recommend is monitor your mites once a month. So for me, I look at every single colony, all 150 colonies I have. I start monitoring probably early March and it go all the way into October. So we're just about to do our last mite check. I do recommend monitoring once a month because one thing I see a lot with certain colonies is you may be under threshold 1 month. So maybe you have zero point 0.5 mites per 100 bees, but the next month you come back, you could have 20 mites per 100 bees. That's how fast these mite levels just explode within your colonies. So, yeah, and I think Molly, yeah, she shared the Honeybee Health Coalition, which is a really great resource. Yeah, Molly, do you think it'd be worthwhile to share the video? I can play the quick 5-minute video, show them how to do an alcohol wash.
I really think it is because
Okay.
if you've never done it before, you're thinking, what on earth are, half a cup of bees? And then when you watch this, you realize it's actually much simpler than it sounds.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will pop the video because I have it right here. Since I think I have some time here.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's present that.
Varroa mite populations can grow rapidly, so you should sample at least 4 times a year. Sampling is most critical following population peak and during the population decrease phase. Be sure to sample again after completing each treatment to make sure that the treatment you selected was effective. This video will show you 2 sampling methods step by step: the powdered sugar shake method and the alcohol or soap wash method. Both methods remove mites from the bodies of adult bees, so you can determine the number of mites per 100 adult bees. This is the infestation percentage. If you have fewer than 10 colonies, sample all colonies each time you sample. For larger apiaries, sample 8 randomly selected colonies. If you have multiple apiaries, randomly select 3 to 5% of your total colonies to sample. For both sampling methods, you will need a wide-mouth jar marked with a line indicating 1/2 cup, a solid lid, a lid with number 8 screen mesh, and a white plate or container. Some beekeeping supply companies sell sampling kits with all the equipment you will need. The only safety equipment you'll need is standard beekeeping protective gear. For the powdered sugar shake method, you will also need powdered sugar and a spray mister filled with water. For the alcohol or soap wash method, you will need alcohol, such as ethanol, ethyl alcohol, isopropyl, or rubbing alcohol, or low sudsing liquid soap, such as automotive windshield washer fluid. For both methods, the first step is to collect the bee sample. To sample a hive, open it and select a brood frame. Look for the queen. If she's present, move her to another frame or set the frame with queen aside. You'll need a sample of about 300 bees. This is a 1/2 cup of lightly packed bees. Collect the sample by tilting the frame slightly and moving the jar downward over the adult bees so they fall into the jar. Or shake bees from 2 or 3 brood frames into a larger collecting container. Then scoop a 1/2 cup of bees and dump them into the jar. For the powdered sugar shake method, add approximately 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar to the jar. Then roll and shake it for at least 1 minute to thoroughly coat the bees with sugar. For consistent results, shake each sample for the same length of time. Set the jar down and wait 3 to 5 minutes. This allows the sample to heat up, which, along with the sugar dusting, dislodges mites from the bodies of the bees. Next, shake the jar like a salt shaker onto the white plate or container. You can repeat the process to improve or verify the accuracy of your count. Add another tablespoon of sugar. Shake again for 1 minute or more. Wait another 3 to 5 minutes. And shake the mites onto the same plate or container as the original sample. High humidity may cause sugar clumping, which can cause some mites to stick in sugar coating at the bottom, reducing the accuracy of the count. Spray the collecting tray with water to dissolve the powdered sugar. Following this, you can return the sampled bees to the hive. This method does not harm them. For the alcohol or soap wash method, take the sample jar away from the colony. Using alcohol around a hot smoker can be dangerous. Add enough alcohol or soap to completely cover the bee sample. Close the jar and shake it vigorously for at least 1 minute. Shaking the liquid dislodges the mites from the bodies of the bees. For consistent results, shake each sample for the same length of time. With a 2-jar sampling device, vigorously wash the bees, drain the liquid through the sample, and count mites. If using a single jar, shake the bees, then pour the liquid containing the mites onto a white plate or tray. Or pour liquid and bees through any filter that separates the bees and mites. The white tray allows you to see and count the mites. Repeat the wash to confirm or improve the accuracy of your count. Add more alcohol or soap to the jar and shake again for the same length of time. This method kills the bees sampled. To preserve the bees, use the powdered sugar shake method. With both methods, count the total number of mites removed from the sample. Divide that number by 300 or by the actual number of bees in the sample if you counted them. This yields the mite level as a decimal. Convert the decimal to a percentage. For example, a sample contains 12 mites. Divide by 300 bees to yield 0.04. Convert that to a percentage, which is a mite level of 4%. To improve the accuracy of your sampling, count the actual number of bees in each sample. As you gain experience, your sample sizes will become more consistently close to 300 bees. The mite levels found in sampling may indicate that further controls are not needed at this time, controls may be needed, or controls are needed now. In general, mite levels below 2% indicate that controls are not needed immediately. Levels above 3% indicate that controls should be applied. Specific thresholds vary according to the colony's developmental phase. See the Tools for Varroa Management Guide for more detailed information on how to interpret your sampling results. Other videos in this series demonstrate how and when to use different Varroa controls.
Yeah, like Molly said, that this is a really great resource. So I do recommend going to the Honeybee Health Coalition and downloading their rural management guide. They have videos on like monitoring, like I mentioned here, plus videos on how to use these different treatments to manage viral levels. And so I'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's a really great resource. One thing I will note about this video here is that they said, 2%. So our thresholds, this is a little bit outdated. So our thresholds are now, 1% rather than 2%. Also with that guide, just note that Texas is a little bit different. So that guide is really, really meant to be kind of a broad guide. But there's some things in Texas specifically that make, rural management harder than, other places in the country. Let me share my screen quick. Yep. So really these are the thresholds we recommend now, and the main reason that these thresholds have changed and gotten lower is because of the viruses are have evolved since these videos were made, and the mites have become even more problematic than they were even I think 10, 15 years ago when those videos were made. So I rely on these thresholds for now, but one thing that they're rapidly evolving. So one thing that's really important is stay in touch with our program as we kind of redefine some of these thresholds and redefine how to manage viral mites. Okay, so So now I guess you kind of have a better idea about how to do an actual mite wash. I do recommend the alcohol wash. It's just much more accurate, especially, here in Texas. And so if you're in the southern part of Texas where it gets really humid, just know that that powder sugar roll is just not going to be as accurate. So I would push anybody doing alcohol wash rather than a powder sugar roll. But really, at the end of the day, if you're monitoring, that's all that matters in my book. So, real IPM. So, what does IPM stand for? It stands for Integrated Pest Management. And that's sort of a fancy way of saying that you have to have a strategy in mind, you have different tools in your toolkit in mind in order to deal with the real mites, especially if they're above threshold. And just know that if you're monitoring, once a month or even four times a year, that these mite levels may be low 1 month, but then spike the next year, where you should be taking immediate action. So that's why it's important to have these kind of treatments available to effectively manage them. So we do the IPM triangle, right? The things you should be really prioritizing are the biggest parts of the triangle. And as the triangle gets smaller, these are things that you should prioritize a little bit less. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be using them, but as an industry, these are things that we should be looking for. So number one is resistant stocks. I won't go into that too much, but if a beekeeper, a bee breeder are breeding for bees that are resistant, that's the best option. But just know that um, yeah, beekeepers may claim that their bees are resistant or they've been treatment free for a very long time. Um, and I'm not saying that's not true or that's not the case, but just always take that with a grain of salt. And so even if you do get bees that are marketed as being resistant to Varroa mites or have been treatment free for X number of years, just make sure that you're still monitoring mites to make sure that you're validating and verifying that they truly are. Because one thing to know here is, when queens go on their mating flights, they fly 3 miles away from the colony and they're mating with a bunch of random drones. So truly, no breeding program can control who the queen's actually mating with. So, that person may have really great queens that are resistant to varroa mites, but the minute they produce new queens for the nucleus colonies or the queens that you're purchasing, they can lose the genetics really quickly. So even if you are buying resistant stocks, always continue to monitor and verify that they actually are or not. Second thing are these sort of mechanical controls for varroa mites. So I did mention caging the queen. Caging a queen is a really great way to manage your varroa levels. It puts your colonies in a broodless state, and it can disrupt reproduction of the mites altogether. Another form of mechanical control is drone brood removal, which I'll talk about. So you can actually put a special frame into your colony, and the mites will jump into those frames. You pull them out, you can freeze them, kill all the brood that way. So mechanical control can be sort of effective, but it may not be as effective as chemical intervention. So we think about the top part of the triangle, different types of chemicals you can use to treat, the varroa mites. We have a mixture of soft chemicals and hard chemicals. So soft chemicals are organic treatments. There's a very, very, very low chance that mites will become resistant to those chemicals. But there are some downsides to using soft organic chemicals, which I'll talk about, which is mainly the temperature restrictions. And so when I talk about, that Honeybee Health Coalition guide being sort of a broad guide, just know that the way that beekeepers manage varroa levels in the northern part of the United States is going to be vastly different than you as a Texas beekeeper, especially if you're in the southern part of Texas. We have hard chemicals. The problem with hard chemicals, well, the benefit of hard chemicals and synthetic chemicals is they work really well. They're very effective, but the downside is we're seeing resistance to them. So I'm going to go to each one to kind of walk you through it. So this is a form of mechanical mite management. So this is drone brood. So drones are the males in the colony, and drones develop for 24 days versus 21 days for a worker or 16 days for a queen. They're also larger and have larger fat bodies. And so because of the longer developmental time and because that they're larger than any other bee within the colony, mites love the drones or the males. And so you can buy drone frames. They're green frames, they have larger cells, and when a queen lays an egg on these frames, they become drones. So what some beekeepers do is they put one drone frame per colony, and then once it's capped just like this, they pull that out and they freeze it. Now, unfortunately, you need to kill all the males, but you're also killing the mites that way. So this is a really effective way for controlling drone levels. After you freeze it, you put the whole frame back in the colony. They'll clean it up. The queen will jump back on, lay eggs again, and you can do that repeatedly throughout a given year. And so this is, this is a really effective way to mechanically control your Varroa levels. But just know that this cannot be your only way of controlling your Varroa levels. I've seen it work, but I've seen it not work as effectively as it really needs to be. But the one thing to note here also too here is that each drone frame you're basically breeding mites, and so if you forget about it, just know if you forget to leave the drone frame in that you're breeding mites and they'll emerge and they'll cause even a larger issue. So this can be really effective, but if you forget, then that can make your mite issue like 10 times worse. So if you do decide to use mechanical method for mite control, just make sure you're on top of it and make sure you're removing that frame in a timely manner. Now we get into soft chemicals. So we think about soft chemicals or organic chemicals. There's currently three on the market. We have oxalic acid, we have thymol, and we have formic acid. So these are really the only three organic chemicals on the market. So, um, yeah. So oxalic acid, this is basically wood bleach. You can actually buy oxalic acid from a bee supply store. Sometimes I'll go to like a Home Depot or something and just buy wood bleach. It's technically cheaper there and make my own mixture that way. Thymol is commercially available. It's basically essential oils, like the thymol essential oil, and that's effective for killing mites. And then formic acid. So I'm gonna go to each one. So thymol, it comes in a bucket just like this. And what you do is you scoop out I guess it kind of looks like a sugar, I guess. It's like a thick sugar. You scoop it out and you put it on a plate just like this, and then you put it onto your colony. This is if you're managing a lot of colonies for a small scale beekeeper, if you only have a few, you can buy these little plates, I guess, that already have the thymol in it. You put them onto the colony and treat them that way. Um the one thing I don't know here is it's temperature dependent. So that means that and this is why I don't necessarily like the label for this treatment. It says you can use it somewhere between 95 degrees and 105 degrees Fahrenheit. I would never, ever, ever recommend a beekeeper using it when it's 105 degrees. I would say the temperature limit for using thymol is about 90 degrees. Even though the label does say up to 105 degrees, I would never use it when it's above 90 degrees. And so that's why if you are reading the Honeybee Health Coalition guide, just take the temperature restriction with a grain of salt because I have seen colonies treated with thymol when it's above 90 degrees, and I've seen it kill, 70% of the queens and cause your colonies to, kill some of the workforce and cause your colonies to get really small. So just be aware of that because it will impact the queens and will impact the colony. Now the way that thymol works, it's a fumigant. So you put that inside your colony. As the temperature increases in the colony, that produces this thymol fume that goes throughout your entire colony. So the way it treats it is not directly contacting the bees or the bee that come in contact with it, but it's fumigating and killing the mites that way. It's also extended treatment. So one thing I mentioned earlier on was, in order to kill your mites, the mites have to be on the back of the bees, right? So when you're looking for a treatment, always look for this extended treatment because, this treatment works for 2 to 4 weeks. What that means is the minute you put that on, it's going to kill the mites in the back of the bees, but it's also going to be working for the next 2 to 4 weeks. So that means as the bees are emerging and as the mites are coming out of the cell, it's going to consistently kill the mites over time. And so what you're really trying to target is that whole reproductive cycle, which is about 21 days. So with any treatment, you want to make sure that you're killing mites for a full 21 days. So you're killing all the mites that are inside the cells and the ones that are coming out of the cells. So that's why the extended treatment is really important. Formic acid. So this is one type of formic acid. It's called Max or Mite Away Quick Strips. It's extremely temperature dependent. It's really harsh on the bees. And their temperature restriction is about 50 to 85 degrees, but I would honestly drop this down to 80 degrees. I probably would not use this if it's above 85 degrees. It's just too harsh of a treatment, impacts the queens, causes queen losses. So I would be very worried about using this and being very careful about your temperature restrictions. Um, Similar to thymol, it's a fumigant treatment, so it means that as it's heating up, it goes through the colony and kills mites that way. Now, one thing, if you do decide to use this treatment, and I think they might mention in the Honeybee Health Coalition guide, I always separate my boxes by an inch, or I may add like a 1 inch rim between my two boxes because you want to make sure that your colony is as ventilated as possible so the fumigant isn't as harsh and won't cause any issue with your queen or your colony. So just simply, if you have two boxes stacked right on top of each other, just move that top box over so there's like an inch of space so the air can get in and let some of that fumigant out. Now, one reason they call them mighty weight quick strips is because it works for about 1 to 2 weeks. And so just know that you may not be killing all the mites inside the brood cells. A new treatment that was recently released by the company is called Formic Pro. So if you are going to use a Formic treatment, I would use this one in Texas. So I think Max works really well in the Midwest. It works really well like in, the upper Great Plains, but in Texas, I probably would not use Max unless the temperature is below 85 degrees, maybe below 80 degrees, which is really hard here in Texas. And so temperature for this says 55 to 92. I think that's pretty fair. It may impact the queen or colony if the temperatures are above that. Similar to max strips, it's a fumigant treatment, so it fumigates the colonies and kill bees that way. But even with the other treatment, you have to make sure your colonies are well ventilated and have enough space to alleviate the stress from this type of treatment. What I also like about this is it can be a 2 to 4 week treatment. So that means you can put it on and it'll kill mites over a 4 week period. So as, like I mentioned, those mites are coming out of the cell, it's going to consistently kill those mites over time. So if you are going to use a formic acid treatment, I would look for this one. Now we get into hard chemicals, which, actually, I don't think I talked about oxalic acid. I'm gonna talk about oxalic acid. I'm not sure why I don't have a slide on oxalic acid. So oxalic acid is something that's very common for beekeepers. I personally would recommend it. I think it's a really great option. It's not temperature dependent, which is really good, and you can apply it in different ways. So there's really 3 different ways you can apply oxalic acid. So one is a drizzle. So you can essentially mix this solution with sugar solution and you can drizzle it over your frames and kill mites that way. But just know if you're using the drizzle, it's a contact treatment. So you're only killing the mites that one time you apply it, and you're not killing any of the mites inside the brood. So that means if you use a drizzle, you should apply this maybe every 3 to 4 days for at least 4 weeks. So that means it might require a bit more time, but it's really cheap and it's really easy to use. Another option is to purchase a vaporizer. So you can buy a vaporizer, put this into the vaporizer, and it produces a fume out of this oxalic acid. So you put it into your hive entrance, it fumigates entire colonies and kill mites that way. But similar to a drizzle, if you're just pouring it right in the colony, it only kills the mites the day of the treatment. So that means you should be applying this every 4 days for at least, 3 to 4 weeks. There's a brand new treatment. It's a strip. It's called Varroxam. You can buy it at any bee supply store, and it works for about 42 to 56 days. So you put these strips into the colony. You need about 3 per box, and it'll kill mites over 42 to 56 days. So one benefit of that is you have to worry about coming back to your colonies every 3 to 4 days. It's not temperature dependent, and it also works very well. Now, th- really the time I would recommend oxalic acid would be during this broodless period. So I would recommend right around now, going into December, I would treat all your colonies with oxalic acid. Your colonies are going broodless, all your mites are exposed, and this is the fastest, most effective way to kill the mites as soon as possible. As for thymol, I think thymol works really well in the spring in Texas. I think this is a really great spring treatment. So, if you think about IPM strategy, what I would do, this is me personally, I think it works really well, is I use oxalic acid in the fall right around now, like either a drizzle or vaporizer or Veroxam. I'd use it again, probably in January or February when the colonies are broodless. And then probably around April, I would use a thymol treatment. Um, you might have to use the full 4 weeks, but I think like the 1 to 2 week treatment would work really well. Formic acid, it's sort of a mixed bag here in Texas because of temperatures, but I really like the combination of these two treatments for managing your viral levels. And if you want to, you can also add the drone brood removal or the mechanical control as part of that strategy. The last treatment, so this is an Apivar strip. This is currently the only hard chemical on the market, and so one benefit of this is it's a long treatment, so 42 to 56 days. It's not temperature dependent, so you can apply it to your colonies at any time. You cannot apply with honey supers because it can contaminate your honey, but other than that, you can apply it any time of the year. But the problem is we're seeing a lot of Varroa resistance to this chemical across the entire United States. So, it may work for your colonies, it may not work your colonies. It's just kind of a mixed bag. And just know that, if you're buying bees from a beekeeper, you're also buying, mites that are resistant to this treatment from other beekeepers. So, a lot of beekeepers tell me, hey, I haven't used a hard chemical ever, but will this chemical actually work? Maybe, maybe not, because if you're buying bees from other beekeepers, you're also buying their mites with them. So just be aware of this. It may or may not work. So just if you are using this, use it with a grain of salt and make sure you monitor consistently. Okay, so yeah, when you think about rural management, just it's really important to develop IPM strategies. So, one, really targeting resistant stocks. I know they can be really hard to come by. That's one thing that we're working on. We're trying to get these resistant stocks into the hands of beekeepers. And so hopefully we can make those steps forward in the next, few years or 5 years or so. But in the meantime, really utilizing mechanical controls like drone brood removal and caging the queen, utilizing soft chemicals like oxalic acid during broodless periods, like right around now and into the spring. Also, maybe utilizing, thymol treatment in the spring, even potentially formic acid. And then I would try to rely less on apivar or synthetic treatments, just with the known resistance. Okay, so that's a lot about varroa mites. Before I move on to diseases and pathogens, are there any questions about treatments for varroa mites or anything along kind of varroa level part of the talk?
Did you see this question is Varroxan considered a maintenance treatment or for actually reducing mite populations? Oops,
Yeah.
sorry, I
Yeah.
moved my microphone, so I was probably far away.
No, no, no worries. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks, Todd. So, yeah, this question was Roxanne. So for those that are new, right, Roxanne is this new oxalic acid treatment. It comes in a strip, and you put it directly into the colony. So, yeah, one thing I will know with Roxanne, with some of the trials that we've done, if your viral levels are too high, it's not going to knock down your viral levels enough. So, I don't know how high that level is, but if you let's say you have 10 mites per 100 bees or 15 mites per 100 bees, that treatment's not going to be hard enough to knock down those mite levels. So in a way, Todd's making a really great point that this is more for potentially, you know, maybe not reducing your mite levels, but maintaining low viral levels. But I will say that it works really well in the winter right around now when they're broodless because it's a contact treatment. So it may not work really well in the middle of the summertime when you have a lot of brood in your colonies, but in the winter it may do a better job of reducing the mite levels. Perfect. I think that's the only question. Okay, I'll get into the pathogens. I'll kind of briefly talk about this. So, we have pathogens. We have four major types. We have bacterial pathogens, fungal pathogens, viral pathogens, microsporidium, which is a gut pathogen. So these are all things that are pretty common that you might see as a beekeeper. I don't want to scare you too much, so I'll kind of briefly talk about some of these pathogens. So the first one is European foul brood. This is probably the most common here in Texas, and this is one type of pathogen that you may see as a beekeeper. This is kind of what the progressed stages of European foul brood looks like. So this is a healthy larva, and as the disease progresses, they become discolored, they kind of get twisted up, and then they start scaling at the bottom of the cell. And so these are the different stages of European foul brood. But one thing I will note here is that it is a bacterial infection. All bees have it, even if you don't see the symptoms. Like if you send me bee samples, for example, all your bees will have European foul brood. And so what that means is the only time you start seeing the symptoms is when your colony stressed. Now, why can your colony be stressed? One is if there's a lack of food, so lack of good pollen and good nectar, your colony can be stressed. You might see this. If your viral levels are really high, you might start seeing this. And so this is typically stress related. And so, if you do have European foul brood, the best thing to do is try to feed your colonies, and over time, the European foul brood will just kind of dissipate, with that. But if you see a really bad problem like this, the best thing you can do is one, control your viral levels, and then queen your colony with a more hygienic queen and a younger queen. But if it's really bad and we know it's not a real problem, the only way to actually effectively treat this is by getting antibiotics. And so you need to work with a veterinarian for the feed directive to get a prescription to actually get the antibiotic to treat this. Another type of pathogen that you might see as a beekeeper is chalk brood. And so chalk brood, like I mentioned, is a fungal pathogen. It starts surrounding the larva and turns them to a mummy. Over time, they produce these kind of fruiting bodies that allow them to kind of spread throughout the colonies. Now, honestly, I used to see this a lot about 20 years ago. We see this less so anymore, mainly because we started breeding for more hygienic bees. I don't have time to talk about hygienic bees, um, because really hygienic bees are the best way to deal with some of these challenges. But you probably won't see chalk brood much anymore, which is really fortunate for all the beekeepers. But if you do see this, similar to European foul brood, I wouldn't get too concerned. It's a stress-related disease because all the bees have chalk brood. You just don't see the symptoms, only when the colony is actually stressed. So the best thing to do is to feed your bees, help them get through that dearth if they're in one, reduce the viral levels, and manage them that way. If you see a persistent problem with this, just requeen the queen with a new queen, change the queen, change the queen, and requeen the queen, and then also try to find a more hygienic stock if possible. Sackbrood virus. This is another virus that you may see as pretty common, similar to European foul brood and chalk brood. It's a stress-related virus, so not Varroa mite related. And so what happens is, and one reason it's called sac brood is because the pupa form a sac at the bottom, and they get kind of disrupted at reproduction at this stage. And so what you'll see is you'll see an open cap like this with kind of the head sticking out. And if you use your tweezers to pull them out, you'll see a kind of sac at the bottom of the larva. And so, like I said, this is a stress-related disease. So you'll typically see this in the spring or during a dearth when there's like a pollen or nectar, or when your colonies have really high, viral levels. So the best thing to do is requeen your colonies, and also purchase a more hygienic stock. So really, the main disease you'll see are all stress-related and things that you can kind of manage and push your bees out of. And also, one thing with sac-brood virus, similar to European foul brood, is all your bees are going to have sac-brood virus, even if you don't see this. And so that what that means is when your colony is really stressed out, you start seeing more of this pop up. Okay, so now we get into the pests. So one pest you may see is small hive beetle. Especially here in Texas, certain parts of Texas, you'll see a lot of small hive beetle kind of running around your frames, and a lot of beekeepers freak out about it and are really concerned about it. I wouldn't be too concerned about small hive beetles. They're always going to be in there. You can take as much management intervention as you want to. You can purchase different things. You can use different products to try to control your small hive beetle population. But the most effective strategy against them is having a strong, vigorous colonies. And you know, I've never seen a colony of mine, personally mine taken over by a small hive beetle, unless my colony dies and the small hive beetle move in, or unless my colonies are really small. So if your colonies are less than two frames of bees or even one frames of bees, your colonies are too weak to manage a small hive beetle, and that's when you start having issues. And so typically when I've seen small hive beetles have issues, for me personally, is when I have my mini mating nooks. These are kind of small miniature colonies about this size that we use for mating queens. And they're really small, and that's when I see small hive beetle take over. So really, as long as your colony is really strong and vigorous, you shouldn't have any problem taking care of small hive beetle. And I really wouldn't worry about it, even if you see a bunch kind of running around. The one thing I will point out about small hive beetle here is that if you're extracting honey, it's really important to pull that honey and extract the honey as soon as possible. Because if you pull honey off a colony, so you take the bees away from that box and you store it into a room for a week or 2 weeks, the small hive beetle will move in and they'll destroy and ferment all your honey and destroy all your frames. And so this is where I see the biggest issue with small hive beetle is, when it becomes an issue. You'll see a bunch of larvae kind of running around and ferment the honey. It's a pretty nasty issue. One thing about small hybrids, I guess I'll mention is that they actually pupate in the soil, and they really like kind of sandy, loamy soil. And so I know here in East Texas, they really like that. They like colonies that are under the kind of shaded area. So if you are really concerned about small hive beetle, and your colonies are under a tree or in a high shaded area, I would move them out into the sun, and that should kind of help alleviate some of the issues. Wax moth. So wax moth is another secondary pest that moves in after your bees die. And so, when I go around the state giving talks to beekeepers about about why bees die and ask beekeepers why their bees died, a lot of people tell me that, hey, wax moth killed my colonies. Wax moth has never and never will ever kill your colonies. So, but what happens is your bees will die and then wax moth will move in and take over. So as a new beekeeper, you may think, okay, my colony's full of this wax moth, a bunch of this feces, so they must have killed my colony. But what happened is your bees died at some point, or they got really small, and the wax moth moved in really quickly. And that's a really big issue here in Texas because the wax moth really love our climate. They move in and destroy your wax within a couple weeks. So, wax moth can lay about 300, 600 eggs daily. That's why they reproduce so quickly, and that's why you see a bunch of issues really quickly. And they produce this webbing and feces. One thing you could do is because one thing what happens is if you have a bunch of boxes that you're storing over the winter, the wax moth will move in and destroy all your frames. So what you could do is you could freeze these frames so the wax moth doesn't destroy them, or you can use this crystal called paramoth to control your wax moth. But this is something you might see within your colony. These are wax moth feces. So if you see pupa in a line just like this and they're uncapped like this, you take your tweezers out and you may see these kind of small black and brown specks on the back of the pupa. And this is a sign of wax moth actually burrowing underneath the cell and leaving feces deposits in there. As long as your colony is strong, that's not a big issue. But what this means is if this colony ever crashes, there's wax moth actually inside your frames, and they'll kind of jump out and take over your entire colony. Okay, so we talk about inspections, right? So, talk about colony health inspections like frames of bees and brood count. I talk about Varroa, diseases, things you should be inspecting for. These are optional things you can inspect for during your colony. This is the way I measure my defensive colonies. It's a very standardized way of measuring defensive colonies. And I really like it because as especially with some new beekeepers, they may not know what an aggressive colony looks like versus a not aggressive colony. So it's a very standardized way of measuring how aggressive your colony is. And it puts on a score from 4 all the way to 16. Now, I won't go too much into detail on this. We do have our 10-week course. We walk through each of these steps and how to actually measure it. But this is really great to know if your colony is actually aggressive or not, because what we're looking for and I actually had to split up on kind of salsa levels. So is your colony a habanero level or is it kind of a mild level? You can also measure weight on your colony. You can grade your colony from 1 to 5 based on weight, or you can take your actual weight. It's really up to you. That's another way of measuring how strong and healthy your colony is. But I'd say this is entirely optional. And then also any notes. So when you're doing your inspections, take any notes within your colony. So if you see any queen cells, note of that. If you see anything that looks abnormal, note that. If you see any bees that look kind of weird, but you're not sure what it is, take a note and take pictures of that because that can help you figure out why your bees died if they do die. Okay. So yeah, when you think about the inspections for the 5 Ps, right? Thinking about how to inspect for parasites, which are the Varroa mites, how to inspect for pathogens, which are viruses, bacterial pathogens, and chalk brood, nutrition, and then poor queens. Now, next, I do want to talk about pesticides a little bit. This is a big issue, and I'm not sure, where the beekeepers are. I know the kind of Todd's in, up in Lubbock. Some beekeepers may be down in San Antonio area, and so different areas of Texas may be at a higher risk for pesticides. So we know pesticide exposure. There's different ways a colony can be exposed to a pesticide. And so the number one way, most toxic way that bees die due to pesticides is due to direct contact. So that means chemicals are sprayed directly onto the colony or near the colony, and that causes massive die-offs almost immediately. Another way is indirect contact. This is probably the most common way. So this is when applicators are spraying on, blooming flowers or a place where bees are foraging. And so when the bees come out and collect pollen or nectar, they're bringing that back into their colony. Or even some systemic, pesticides. Those can actually go through the plant and get into the pollen and nectar sources. So as the bees are bringing that back, that not only kills the bees that are foraging on it, but also young developing brood or even other workers are feeding on that for their nutrients. Drift is probably more common in the panhandle, but I guess if there is applicators for mosquito abatement, other things like that, and it's really windy, for example, these chemicals can get blown and drift onto either directly onto a colony or indirectly onto a flower source, and then finally contaminated water. So these are just different ways that bees can be exposed to pesticides. think about pesticides, there's really three major types of pesticides. We have insecticides. Now, insecticides are the most toxic to bees because, they're developed for insect pests. And so any type of insecticide, I guess I wouldn't say any insecticide, but most insecticides have at least some toxicity to bees, either directly to the bees or whether they can drift onto a hive or onto a flower source the bees actually foraging on. So in most cases, insecticides have at least some toxicity to bees. Fungicides are sort of a mixed bag. Some are toxic, some aren't toxic. But oftentimes fungicides are used in conjunction with insecticides that make them even more toxic. So, but yeah, I mean, it really depends on the type of fungicide because most aren't toxic, but some can be. Herbicides. So I would say 95% of herbicides aren't toxic to bees. Um, the way they're toxic is they kill the flowering plants the bees are actually foraging on and bring it back to their colony. There are some herbicides that are toxic to bees, but the way that they're most toxic is to take away a lot of the flowering sources for the bees in the spring. So these are different signs of an acute bee kill. And so some of these symptoms are very, very similar to, um, yeah, a lot of these are very similar to kind of a mite damage. And so sometimes I get pictures, I'll be like, okay, that's real mites, but the beekeepers think it's insecticides. So it's really important to know the difference between an insecticide kill versus maybe a kill that's related to viral mites. And so especially due to um, pesticide damage or directly onto your colony, you may see sudden bee losses. So you'll see piles and piles of dead bees in front of the colony, just like this. Um, Most of the bees will be gone out of the colony and they'll be piled at the bottom. Whereas for Varroa, you won't see any bees left in your colonies. You may see a few left behind. But this is really a clear sign of a pesticide kill. And you see the piles of dead bees come around this person holding the bees. You'll start seeing this kind of twitching and shaking behavior. So the bees, their legs are shaking. They're kind of paralyzed, unable to move. This is also another sign, because these pesticides are impacting the nerve system of the bees. So you see this massive shaking by the bees. And then you see their tongue sticking out. Now, tongue sticking out can be also a sign of might kill, but we see tongue sticking out in conjunction with these two other signs. That could be a sign of an acute kill. Okay. And then even chronic damage, these are things that are hard to observe by a beekeeper. One thing I like to mention here is that, wax inside the frame, it's hydrophobic. So that means it can absorb everything from the environment. So, you know, if I actually tested your wax, you may have chemicals inside that wax that's impacting foraging, impacting queen health, and impairing navigation. And so that's why it's really important to rotate your wax. So I try to only keep wax that's about 5 years old within my colony. After 5 years, I throw that wax in the garbage and then start all over again, just to make sure I start with a clean bill of health with the colonies. So, if you have frames that's 15 to 20 years old, it's been absorbing chemicals from the environment for 20 years. And so that's going to impact a lot into your colonies. So, one thing to reduce this type of chronic damage is by rotating your comb out and replacing it every 5 years if possible. One thing you might see if you have kind of high pesticides exposure within your apiary is this symptom known as entombed pollen. So what bees have a very innate way of knowing whether pollen's healthy or not. And one way they prevent other bees from consuming that pollen is by entombing it with resin from trees. So, maybe you guys covered this during 101, but the bees are collecting resin from trees. They're, um, producing propolis from it, and they're not only covering the holes in the colony, but coating their colony to protect themselves. But they also use that to actually coat the pollen that's contaminated with fungicides or insecticides. And if you use trusty tweezers and actually open it up, it'll always be kind of this dark brick red color. And if I tested for this, it'd be have 100 different chemical residues within that pollen. So one thing I see with some bee colonies in high agrochemical areas, you'll see a lot of the frames is packed full of this entombed pollen. So when you think about chemicals and whether chemicals, I mean, whether you're applying the chemicals or whether an applicator is applying the chemicals, the one thing to note is residual toxicity. So, obviously it's important to know that the chemical is toxic, but the most important part, I guess in my opinion, is to know how long that chemical is toxic to bees. So when you look at the residual toxicity, and usually this is on a label, you look for residual toxicity that's either 4 hours or less. Because what that means is you can apply these chemicals in the evening, And by the time the bees are foraging the next day, it's no longer toxic to the bees. But if you have chemicals that have a toxicity for more than 8 hours or even multiple days, that means you can cover your colonies overnight, but the bees are going to be foraging the next day, and they have a chance to be exposed to that chemical and cause some issues then. And so, if you are using a chemical in your yard or your neighbor is, try to recommend chemicals that have a residual toxicity for less than 4 hours. Ideally, no toxicity at all. So I'm gonna kind of walk you through how to read a pesticide label. They make these as confusing as possible, so I'll sort of walk you through this, because all the information you need about whether it's toxic to bees is on the label. But like I said, if you have any questions about pesticides and how long they're toxic to bees, shoot me an email. I have a list of 500 chemicals that's used across the world, and I can tell you that this chemical is, toxic for 48 hours. So if you come to me and say that somebody using bifenthrin, I can say, hey, this is toxic for, 2 days. So this is what you need to do to prevent any damage. But typically all this will be on the pesticide label. It won't tell you the exact number, but it'll give you some idea about how long it's toxic for. So if you go to the label under the environmental hazard section, there'll be a label that says foraging or visiting. If it says foraging or visiting, that means that that chemical is toxic for more than 8 hours. So even though if that chemical is applied at night, it's still going to be toxic to the bees the next day. If it says actively foraging or actively visiting, that means this chemical is toxic for less than 8 hours. So this is probably a better option. So those are what you should be looking for. And if people ask you questions about how they can help, support your bees, try to ask them to use chemicals that have lower residual toxicity. Now, one thing that Texas is now part of is this new program called Field Watch. And so Field Watch is a program, and really the goal is to increase communication between the beekeepers and the applicators. And so to me, the biggest issue is how can the applicators actually communicate with the beekeepers so that they can take the steps to prevent any damage from pesticides to their actual colonies. So, this is an entirely free program. There's no cost involved with this program. And the best way to know whether chemicals are being applied to your area is to apply for this program. Now, I will say this is a brand new program, so we're trying to grow it as fast as we can so it can be as useful as possible. And so I would recommend signing up for this program. So I'll kind of walk you through it briefly. So there's a portal for the beekeepers. You go into that portal. You can mark your colonies as being open to the public, or you can mark them as being closed to the public. And if you mark them as closed, that means the only people that can see those colony locations is me as an apiary steward, and then any applicator that's spraying around your area. Other than that, nobody can see your location, and it's only open to me and some of the applicators. So you go into that system, you type in the location of your bees, and that's just one way the applicators can log in and alert you. Now for the applicator side, you have to be up on your CU credits, so you have to be a certified applicator in the state of Texas to be onto the system. You need to make sure that you re-up your credits every single year. Once you go on it, you can say that, hey, I'm spraying in this area, and you can alert all the beekeepers in that area. So, I think one problem that we've had in the past is an applicator has no way to contact the 50 beekeepers around the area. So this would be a fast, efficient way for applicator to contact you as a beekeeper and say, hey, I'm spraying in this area. You should either move your colony or do something about it. So I do recommend it. It's free of charge. And if you have any questions about it, you can give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm happy to walk you through the whole program. Okay, well, I covered a lot. I guess I have 5 minutes, but I do want to talk about our master beekeeping program. So this is a website for the program. If you go onto this website, there should be a link on the right side to sign up for a listserv. That's how you can receive updates from not only our master beekeeping program, but also our other extension activities across the state. So this is one of the best ways to keep in touch with our program. But if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. We do have a master beekeeper coordinator, so I can kind of forward your information to her to help you kind of get started. But really, the best way to get started is join a listserv, and then we'll have an email soon about our 10-week course in the spring. You can either attend the live session for that 10-week course or watch recordings afterwards. And as for your first level, that's the only thing you need to do is take that 10-week course, have colonies for a year, and then you can test, probably sometime late next year to move up to the next level if you decide. Here's a QR code for our Facebook page. So I recommend following our Facebook page. We post constant updates about our fact sheets that we're developing, the programs that we have, the Beekeeping 101, 201s, and Master Beekeeping Program. That's all posted on our Facebook page. So with that, I guess I do have a few minutes for questions, unless it's okay for me to go overtime.
I'm okay with you going overtime. I'm just
Okay.
here. So as long as you need to answer them all. And you guys, there's not a lot of us on here. So if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, you're more than welcome to do that. If you don't want to type it in the chat. Glenn asked if it's possible to get a copy of your presentation slides. Are you okay with sharing that?
Yeah, I can send you the presentation slides and I can send you the inspection sheet also.
Okay. And then once I get that, guys, I'll send it to you in an email, but I'll also put it in that virtual classroom.
So I'm looking at questions. Okay.
There were a couple of questions that I answered, but maybe you have a different answer for. Oh, sorry. Is someone asking? Well, one was how effective are screen bottom boards in controlling Varroa mites? And then there was a similar question asking about that for monitoring.
Yeah, so as for how they're effective for managing mites is they're really not effective at all, right? So you think about how you can manage mites is you have to find a way to kill the mites and knock the mites off the back of the bees, right? And so whether that's due to a chemical or whether that's due to some kind of intervention. So, even if you use a screen bottom board, there's no way for that screen bottom board to, knock the mites out the back of the bees and kill them that way. So, the mites are probably naturally just dropping out the bees just due to their behaviors, but it's not like a way for managing your viral levels. As for ways to monitor it, I do know a lot of beekeepers that use sticky boards or screen bottom boards for monitoring mites. It's just not as accurate as alcohol wash, and we don't have clear thresholds for measuring that. Also, in my opinion, it's gonna take a lot more time to use a sticky board versus just an alcohol wash because there's a lot of mites under there and you're trying to count them all. I would just rather if I'm using a threshold to use the most accurate measurement as possible.
You see that question that just popped in?
Yeah, so BW, I am doing mite checks tomorrow. If counts are high, would you recommend treating with OA? Second part, have you seen the usage of Swedish sponges soaked in OA as a treatment option similar to Roxanne strips? If so, okay. So I'll start with the first part. So I would recommend probably OA this time of the year. Just it's because like you could use formic acid or thymol, but I do not recommend that as kind of a late fall treatment. So I think OA is probably your best option, especially going broodless. So you either use a drizzle, vaporizer, or the Roxanne strips. As for Swedish sponges, I would say with Swedish sponges is there's really not a lot of data on how to actually use Swedish sponges be effectively. Like I've done some trials with beekeepers using them, and the problem with that is there's definitely a lot of user error when you're actually making that mixture and making up your own Swedish sponges, right? So one thing that's really great about Roxanne is like the way they develop the strip, that's gonna be consistent treatment over 42 to 56 days. Whereas Swedish sponges, depending on how you mix it, depending on the temperature outside, depending on so many different variables, you just have no control on how effective it's gonna work. So, I'd probably go more towards the proven product and the proven developed product rather than make my own mixture. It's not to say that you can't play around with it at all. But if I'm gonna be using a treatment, I want to make sure that it works, it's proven to work.
And then I haven't emailed everybody this, but there is a free webinar on a new product, Naroa. Is that what it's called?
Varroa.
And it is November. It's in November, I think,
November
but
14th at
November
6.
14th. But I'll email everyone in the class the information on that. It's a new product, and the manufacturer, I guess, is going to be talking about it and how it works. So potentially another option.
Yeah, with an Aurora, it's not approved in Texas quite yet, but my impression is it's gonna be legal in Texas probably the next few weeks to a month or so. So it's gonna be legal pretty soon, maybe by the webinar. And then Adam, who's kind of the person marketing it, is going to be on it to answer any questions. One thing I will mention, we're actually doing a trial with them, so we'll see how effective the treatment actually works. So an unbiased trial. That's one of the rules with extension. So hopefully we can provide you some more updates about how it works and how to actually use it.
I have a question on the forced brood break with a queen. Um, I've seen those like square cages, so I'm assuming that you would cage her in an area that has capped brood so she doesn't have a place to lay.
No,
Is
yeah.
that
So
how it
what you can do is you can get those queen cages. Like there's different setups, but you can put it in an area where she can still lay. So you're basically restricting her to lay in a small area. So instead of laying in an entire colony or on multiple frames, she's only restricting that small space, and then you can slowly move that over time. So you're still allowing the queen to lay eggs, but there's just less overall brood within the colony.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Mary, is neuro a strip or what type of treatment is it? Yeah, they're gonna have different options. So one option is to mix the solution directly into your sugar water. So you basically feed your bees with the treatment in it, and then they're gonna have I guess like a pack. So you put that pack directly on top of the colony, and then the bees consume it, and then that's how they transfer it to the larva. Because really the way it works is the bees are consuming it, they're putting that into the larva, and that knocks out basically knocks out a gene, so the mites are unable to feed and they just kind of die within the cell. That's kind of the concept of the treatment, and they've been working on it for, man, I have to say I heard about this about 20 years ago, so it's been a really long process to get this up. The one downside is probably the expense of it. It's probably gonna be about $30 to $40 a treatment. And I'm not entirely sure how well it works. I'm curious to see what their results are and the results of our trial. But if it does work, that could be a really great option that we definitely need this time, especially with the resistance that we're seeing.
Like all new things, if they're expensive at first, but over time they get a little cheaper.
Exactly, exactly. I'm going through this. I'm not sure if I have any other questions. Yeah, Mary. Yeah, the bees really do chew on the Viroxan. Yep. Yeah, and one thing with Roxanne, I will note is make sure you follow the label, because a lot of beekeepers don't apply enough strips per colony, so a lot of them have been using Apivar for a long time, which is basically 2 strips per box. But I think Viroxan's probably somewhere around 3 to 4 strips per box to actually work effectively. So make sure you follow the label and have enough strips for it to actually work properly. And actually within these treatments, follow the label.
Yeah, and it has. I just used it, and I was very shocked at how much I had to put in the boxes. But it has a nice little table. It makes it very easy. But you're right. We're so used to just doing 2 that I was like, oh my gosh, is this okay?
Yep, exactly.
I'll see.
Yeah, I think Viroxan has a lot of great potential. So, if you were thinking about treatment, I think putting Viroxan right around now is perfect because your colonies will go broodless in a month. It'll kill the mites now, but also when they go broodless and all the mites are exposed. So I think Viroxan's a really, really great, fall treatment.
Hey guys, any other questions? If not, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Slater, for presenting today. I think we all learned something. I certainly did. So we appreciate it. Y'all know that, mites are an issue. And so hopefully you learned a little bit more for your toolbox to try to manage them and monitor for them. And I will email the notes once I get them. I will also be on the lookout for an email in a week or two, just so after you digest all of this, and if you missed a class, maybe watched it, just an evaluation that just helps us justify our program. So if you get it in the email, I would so appreciate it if you would answer it. And everybody have a good fall and winter, and good luck in the spring, coming out with hopefully happy and healthy bees.